I notice a big focus in the book is human behavior. How do we change human behavior?
Well, that's not a big focus. It's the focus.
It's the focus, yeah. I mean, how do you even suggest we get started with that?
We have changed human behavior. Look at you. You are running this podcast. You're a woman. That wouldn't have happened 50 years ago. I suppose the technology existed. That wouldn't have happened.
Welcome to the Sarah Tajima podcast, where we discuss conscious design for humanity and the planet.
Today, my guest is Don Norman. Don Norman is famous for pushing doors when they should be pulled, Norman doors. He has been a professor and an Apple VP. He has a lot of honors, 3 honorary degrees, member of the National Academy of Engineering and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has 21 books, including Emotional Design, The Design of Everyday Things, and Design for a Better World, Meaningful, Sustainable, and Humanity-Centered. The book compelled him to move from writing to actually doing something. His charity, the Don Norman Design Award, rewards early career practitioners who practice what he preaches, and we will link it in the show notes. Please enjoy this episode with Don Norman. Don, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Very excited to have you here. I was reading your book, and then we had reached out, someone from my team had reached out to invite you, and I found that it was just a perfect alignment in terms of your new book.
That's good.
And so I'm very excited to dive into it.
Okay, let's go.
So to get started, I know you're officially retired, but I get the sense that you're not. What are you up to now?
Well, this is my 5th retirement. You know, when people retire, the normal people, and they say, look forward to retirement because I'll have nothing, no boss, nothing to do. And they love it for the first 6 months, and then, well, they get bored and they don't know what to do with their life. And actually, it turns out a fair number of people die because there's nothing to live for. So I keep busy. But it's easy because mostly I'm an academic, and academics don't have any trouble because we're always doing things, and there's really no age limit. And so when I retired the last time, it was December 2020, and I said, what should I do with myself now? And I thought about, well, what I really am is an educator, and I educate through lectures and through my students, but primarily through my books. That's what reaches the largest audience. And so I thought, look, the world is a mess. All my work has been about making things easier to use and easier to understand, and that's important, but it's not going to change the world. So what can I do? And I look and I thought about all the problems, and I said, I read about them, and yeah, people understand it very well. There's nothing I can add. Well, what about the solutions? Well, I looked at the solutions, and most of them are technological, but I said, yeah, these are really very good. There's very little for me to add. But how come nothing has happened? And I realized that the real problem was human behavior. The United Nations has been meeting now. They have a meeting they call Committee of the Parties. Horrible name, it's the United Nations, where every nation must agree. And this meeting, COP, has been meeting 28 years. We just finished COP28, and they will come out with these wonderful resolutions. Well, they're not wonderful because since every country has to agree, they have to water it down. But still, nonetheless, even the watered down ones, no one has done. So what can I do about this? And that's what I did is I wrote the book about what these big issues are. And I made sure that I wasn't just the only one stating them. So all the issues from other people, their analyses. I also said, here are the solutions, and I found really good solutions. Again, so it wasn't just me, some crazy person with a solution. No, here's good ones that lots of people have talked about, and a few small adoptions. And why not? Why not better? And that's what the book is about, and that's what keeps me busy. That, and there's a secondary thing that when I started the design lab at the University of California, San Diego, oh, there are no designers in San Diego. How can we have a major design lab? Well, there were thousands of designers. We slowly found them, but they didn't know about one another. So we tried to bring them together. And then we said, maybe we need an energizing source. And so the World Design Organization, which is in Quebec, organizes a World Design Capital contest every 2 years. In fact, I was at the very first World Design Capital, which is Torino, Italy, when it was the capital. And I was in Seoul, Korea. Well, I was at KAIST teaching in Korea when Seoul became the World Design Capital. And I watched one of my colleagues become vice mayor of Seoul to help them set up the programs. well, why don't we? So we did. We decided, it took us 7 years to bring everybody together and become the world design capital. We had to bring in the mayors of San Diego. We decided to make it jointly with San Diego, Tijuana. So we brought in the mayors of Tijuana. And the World Design Organization says, you can't do that. It's only one city, one country. We did it anyway, and we won. So we're the world design capital this year. That keeps me busy. And I'm also trying to learn Spanish. That keeps me busy. So yeah, I'm actually unbelievably busy, more busy than I've ever been. But the difference between being busy when you're retired versus being busy in your job is everything I'm doing is something I want to do and I really enjoy. Just if it wasn't quite so much.
You're really a prolific writer. And so am I correct to say that you've written about 21 books?
This is book 21.
I'm so curious to learn a little bit more about your process because I listened to another podcast with you where you said you don't go into it with the kind of topic of the book. It sort of comes about organically.
I write a book in a couple of months. And people say, what? How can you do that? Well,
yeah.
But I don't start the book for a couple of years, 3 or 4 years usually. If you look at the period between books, they're quite long. The last book I did actually was 10 years ago. It was the updating of Design of Everyday Things. That came out in 2013, and this book came out in 2023. So I've been thinking a lot about the issues in the world and how to approach it. And so what I need to write a book is I need to have a deep understanding of the issues, but more importantly, a deep understanding of what my take will be on it and how I'm going to structure it. And I have to have a story in my head. Now, quite often, as I write the book, that isn't what I produce. So I never know what I'm going to write until I'm all finished. So, yes, I wrote this book pretty quickly, and then I was taught from it. I always teach from my books because I learned a lot from that. And it was the wrong book. I wrote a book called 4 Maxims to Save the World. And what I was writing was fine, but the structure was completely wrong. And so actually I submitted it to publishers. And one publisher said, well, we would love to publish a book by Don Norman, but this is not the right book. But he's clearly worked so hard on it that he wouldn't revise it. So no, pass. Fortunately, the MIT Press said, this is a great book. It has great potential. We don't think it's quite the right book, but we'll work with it. And yeah, I like that. So we changed the book quite dramatically. But, the content didn't change that much. So the 4 maxims, well, they became 4 of the sections. There are 6 sections in the book, and they are 4 of them. But the structure is completely different.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What made you change the title?
Well, because I changed the book. I changed the structure. And so we went through a bunch of titles, and Design for a Better World, well, that really captures what I'm about. Now, turns out that a lot of people have used that phrase. And there was a longer subtitle about meaningful and sustainable and humanity-centered. And with time, we started leaving out words. And pretty soon I said, why not just call it meaningful, sustainable, and humanity-centered? So that's it.
Yeah.
And by the way, first of all, the book is catching on, and in interesting ways. I'm going to Thailand in August, where they're running a conference called Design for a Better World.
Oh, awesome.
And
was that a coincidence?
No, it's not a coincidence. Well, I was at a conference in Shanghai in October last year, and I met this woman from Thailand who said they wanted to do that. And so would I come? Of course I'll go. And then also I was in Singapore. That same trip I went to Shanghai, I went to Singapore. And I go into the Singapore Polytechnic, and they have this big poster about humanity-centered design. And I said, oh, that's interesting. That's not a phrase that is really in use. Where did you hear it from? And they said, from your book. And so now actually I'm being invited by Manila to give a talk, to come to their conference right after the one in Thailand. And I met with them yesterday to prepare, and I noticed 2 of the people were from Singapore Polytech. And they said, I asked them why. This is Manila. And they said, no. We're an organization of schools around this area, which includes the school in Thailand that you're going to. And so, yes, we want that it's Manila's time, but yes, it's humanity-centered is going to be the theme. So it's catching on, and that's really pleases me because I feel I want the world to be humanity-centered, and human-centered is wrong. And I've also got the Aga Khan Foundation, which is a major foundation. People in the United States have not heard of it, but they work mostly in Africa and Asia, but they are international across all countries. They're headquartered in Geneva. So I flew to Geneva to talk to them. And they do human-centered design. And when I looked at how they were doing, and I said, no, that isn't human-centered. That's humanity-centered. Human-centered, it was designed particularly to make sure we do really good products so that companies could sell them and make more profits. Here's what's wrong with human-centered. There's nothing wrong in what I teach. There's nothing wrong in the principles, nothing wrong in what we're doing. What's wrong is what we don't talk about. We don't talk about the harm that we do to the environment in mining to get these wonderful materials that we make the stuff out of, or in the way we smelt and manufacture. We do a lot of harm because we make products that, well, they only last a couple of years. You have to get a new one. And we also make them so svelte and pretty and attractive that you can't open them up and reuse the parts. And that leads to the waste. And even digital products, you would think, oh, no, there's no harm. We don't do any mining. Well, it has to run on a physical product. And second of all, they're often designed to be addictive, which really is bad for culture, for people. We haven't talked about that, and that's what humanity-centered is. It's human-centered design plus thinking about the long-term impact upon the environment, upon cultures, upon all living things, not just people, because we're a complex system, and even animals and even insects and plants, if they start dying, so too will the human race.
Yeah, I love that distinction between going from, believing that, the right orientation is around human-centered design to humanity-centered, and that means expanding how we look at the impact of design.
Yes.
One thing that really stands out to me is that, first of all, you seem to have a very curious mind. But the second thing I noticed is that, I read your first book, which is kind of like a design Bible, and then I read emotional design after that. It really stood out to me that you're quick to say, well, I was wrong about this. You're constantly continuing your exploration.
Yes, that's first of all, I try to teach all my students to be curious, to ask about the world. It's really interesting because one of the things I notice in my own curiosity is I go on walks. I go for running, but now at my age, I replace it with 2.5 to 3.5 mile walks up and down hills. But that means I'm continually exploring spaces. And sometimes I see really interesting things and I stop and try to puzzle it out. But the interesting thing is sometimes I see things and I go and I get home and shower, etc. And then sometimes even the next day I think back and I say, wait a minute, that was really interesting. And I have to go back and look at it again and explore, because the curiosity didn't trigger me until a day later. And so I tell my students to do that. And second, I believe in learning a new topic every year. Some people stay in the same field, the same issues for their entire lives. And that's fine. Those become specialists and they advance our knowledge, and that's important. Because maybe I'm driven by curiosity, I've ended up being a generalist. I'm interested in almost everything. And you can't do everything at once, so I vary from moment to moment. I've changed my careers many times, and even within a career, I've changed the things I focus upon. If you look at the design books, you said my first book, that was about book 11 or 12, because the other books were in psychology and cognitive science. But if you look at each design book, is approaching a very different topic within design. And I had to learn a lot to do each new book.
Yeah, I really enjoyed in the approach to emotional design saying we haven't really valued this before, but actually we need to value emotions because humans are irrational. And
no, humans are not irrational. What does irrational mean? Humans are humans. We work the way we work, and we're driven by many different things, but not logic. One of my standard statements that I make all the time to engineers who design things is the problem with what you've done, it's too logical. People are not logical. Logic was not the normal way people think. In fact, logic was invented by mathematicians and philosophers. It's not how people think. And we have two different mechanisms. This is an oversimplification, but one of them is cognition, which is understanding the world, which can be slow. And the other one is emotion, which is this safe or dangerous, good or bad? And there are different kinds of emotions, but some of those emotions are really fast because if you're in a dangerous situation, you don't want to stop and think. You want to be able to react quickly. And some of them are very slow. It's reflective. You're thinking back over the past day or week or even year and trying and seeing what your lesson might be. Or sometimes we make up imaginary scenarios and get furious and angry at people for doing things that they didn't do, that we just imagined. Or sometimes we get very excited and happy about things that people have done, which they haven't done, we just imagined. But emotions are very different. And the cognitive system is mostly electrical. Neural impulses and spikes, which is like today's neural networks. The emotional system is chemical, and it's very different. And it changes the operation of the brain. We are very focused when we're anxious, alert. The negative emotions make us really focused upon things, which is, you want to be slightly focused like that, slightly anxious when you are doing work, because that prevents you from being distracted. The opposite side, the positive emotions, make you curious and sensitive to changes in the environment. That makes you much more creative, but it's a very different way of thinking. And so it's very hard to keep people, some people who are always talking about something else, and they'll change the subject mid-sentence and they'll go on, and we call it scatterbrained, because that's too much of a good thing. And being narrowly focused is too much of a good thing. We need to have both in our lives. But see, those are driven by the emotions. Neural networks don't have that.
I'm curious if you have advice for people on how to be more creative.
Creativity means doing something that's new and unusual. I was at a conference running a panel where one of the designers was gleefully telling how he preaches people to be creative, and how when someone does something that's similar to what somebody else did, he exposes them and they have to be creative. And I said, why? Why do you have to be creative? If we have a good solution to a problem, why don't we copy it? Or maybe expand it or modify slightly for this particular purpose. That's how science works. We don't always pride on brand new ideas and brand new things. We pride ourselves on taking ideas and expanding them and making sure they're correct and checking them out, but getting the details all right and working hard. So what's creativity? What I care about is identifying what the real issues are and then figuring out what the solution should be. In doing that, sometimes we can't find the existing solutions. We have to be creative. Quite often, though, the creativity, there's nothing, when we talk about people being creative, nothing comes from nowhere. A brand new idea that nobody ever thought of. Oh, wow, gee, how creative you are. No, all creativity is taking old ideas that are around, but combining them in novel ways. You cannot find a single example of things that are really creative that wasn't actually being done by other people, but not the same thing, but the ideas were. So what I care about is not creativity. I care about, have you solved not the symptoms of the problem, but the real underlying causes that will really be helpful to the world?
Yeah, staying focused on the problem. So when it comes to the book, one of the first chapters starts with economics, and this is also something that I've spoken about in my newsletter on conscious design, which is essentially just a different name for design a better planet or a better world. I'm curious, why did you start the book with the topic of economics? How is that significant?
The economists really rule the world. They determine a lot of government policies, a lot of corporate policies, and it's all driven by an emphasis on money, really. The economists have these wonderful mathematical models, and they measure everything. They follow the belief that if you can't measure it, you don't understand it. So they measure things that you can't measure, but they measure them anyway. So they can't measure them, so they measure something else, and they name it by what they care about, and they assign numbers to it. And once you assign a number, it's scientific. And then the mathematics. People almost never question the assumptions that the economists have made. They question the mathematics. But the mathematics, they're always correct. But you know what? But the economists are almost always wrong. And so don't we want to think about that? How come? Isn't that bothersome? Well, they almost never look back. Very few economists check to see whether other economists have been correct or not, unless they're pushing their own theory and they want to show that somebody else's was wrong. They don't understand people, yet they model people. The whole about economics is about people, and they assume people are motivated by logical reasons. Well, you've heard me say that logic isn't how people think or even how they work. And we do things that are irrational only according to this logic that we have imposed upon them. But it's not irrational. It's usually there's a reason for why people have done it, whether it's emotional, whether it's cognitive, whether it's historical, whatever it is, there's a reason, whether it's situational, and it's not irrational. And so why do they have so much power? Now, a lot of my friends, well, a number of my friends have been trying to demolish this kind of view. My economic friends aren't, but my psychology friends have been. And they're trying to show that a lot of the assumptions of economists are not right. But I remember when the first of my friends, Herb Simon, got the Nobel Prize in economics. Oh, I heard about it while I was driving my car near my university. So I drove back to the university, UC San Diego, and I went to my friends in the economics department and said, hey, Herb Simon got the Nobel Prize. And they said, what a waste of the Nobel. First of all, he wasn't an economist. And second of all, what he's talking about, people are limited processors and so on. And you should satisfy instead of optimize. So that was the first one. But I was pleased to say the Nobel Committee has been very positive, and they finally gave one to Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman. Well, not correct, not completely. Amos made a mistake. He died, and you can't get it if you die. But these two people, they're psychologists. I've known them since they were graduate students. They've been demonstrating that everyday things that we think is obviously true, just think about it, is false. Not how people think and not how people behave. And that positive gains are different than negative gains, or if you like, losses. And they did all sorts of wonderful stuff. So hurrah for the Nobel Committee. And then people have also gotten Nobels in what's now called behavioral economics. And so slowly the economic profession is changing. But that's what I was talking about, is that the way they look at things. Again, they like a single numerical measure. Gross domestic product is the one I talk about, but they do lots and lots of measures they do lots of measures of complex things, and they find some simple number to represent it. On the stock market, well, is this a risky stock or not? How do they measure risk? They don't know how. So they take the standard deviation of the price, that's a statistical measure, and they call that risk. Well, it's not risk, but they call it risk, and that's what we use to judge whether stocks are risky or not. So that's why I started, because they are so dominant in this world, and it's time that they became more realistic. And there are economists who are doing the right kind of work, but they've been shunned. Fortunately, they're now coming into, people are starting to listen to them.
Yeah. Is there an economist that you would recommend?
Well, no, I'm not going to name, because they tend to be the younger group. Well, Rich Thaler is a good example of an economist. He also got the Nobel. He wrote the book on nudging. In fact, I was teaching at Northwestern in those days, and he came over to my office and said, I'm writing this book that's really a psychology book. So I wrote a nice blurb for the book, because it really was. I read the book and wrote the blurb. And he's been continuing, and he's a behavioral economist at the University of Chicago, which is sort of the enemy of behavioral economics. So he wrote a book about his own history, about how it took him a while before they accepted him. Getting the Nobel Prize really helps, because that's where Milton Friedman comes from. And he's the person who said it's responsible only to the well-being of its shareholders, not to its employees, not to its customers, not to the location where it's. That's all nonsense, complete nonsense.
Where do you think we got so sidetracked with the focus on profit?
It's been an economic issue, and it certainly was true in the East Indian Project, or whatever they call the corporation in England many, many years ago. So Western Europe, it comes from Western Europe. But I'll point out that it's in the Bible. Jesus Christ said, throw out those money changers. Now, the problem with Jesus' statement is that the money changers actually did a service, because in the early days in Jerusalem, the different countries had different kinds of money. And if you came into Jerusalem, you had to switch your money from whatever country you came into whatever is used in Jerusalem, and they changed the money for you. But they charged outrageous fees, absolutely. And when he said throw them out, he meant throw them out of the temple. He was therefore approaching the symptom. And I argue you have to approach the underlying cause. So instead of saying we have to figure out how they should not be making these outrageous profits, but rather just be offering this very useful service, but he simply said, go someplace else. So yeah, they went someplace else and still did the same unfortunate activity. Well needed, but not done well. So it's been in culture for thousands of years.
Hey, it's me. I want to drop into this timeline here to remind you that if you follow me, rate and review the podcast and send me a screenshot, you can send it to me on Instagram or at sarahtajima@substack.com. I will respond to you with a free guide to growth so that you can start to have impact and think from a business lens.
I notice a big focus in the book is human behavior. How do we change human behavior?
Well, that's not a big focus. It's the focus.
It's the focus, yeah. I mean, how do you even suggest
we have changed human behavior? Look at you. You are running this podcast. You're a woman. That wouldn't have happened 50 years ago. I suppose the technology existed. That wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, true.
Women novelists often had to disguise their names and use male names to get published. But that has changed dramatically. You may argue that, well, no, it isn't completely there yet. And that shows it takes a long time, but it's been a dramatic change. The same with gender, the whole notion of gender, the fact that we can speak of the fact, whether you agree or not that this is true, that there might be male and female is not the only. That is nature really binary with strong distinctions between this and that? No, nature is continuous. But those have changed over time.
At what points do you think we see change happening at a really rapid pace?
Well, it depends upon your definition of rapid. If I'm bringing out a new product that is really exciting, it seems rapid. The internet took 20, 30 years to be, but some of the new social media gets captured quickly. And this cell phone, still took decades before it really got adopted. But by now, almost everybody, it's amazing how many people in the world, even in the impoverished areas of the world, have phones. We may have to pay $1,000 or 1,000 euros for a phone, but there you can buy a pretty smart phone for $10, $20. Now, $10 or $20 is still a lot of money for a lot of them, but it's approachable. That's a revolution that in revolutionary years is fast. For those who lived through it, if it takes 10 years, that's a long time. But by standard times, that would be really fast.
One of the things I notice is that when I'm talking about conscious design and, trying to get more people involved, is that a lot of people are just really focused on the work that's, let's say, figuratively in front of their desk. Exactly what has to do with the work that they're working on. And I noticed that your book really kind of zooms out, and we're starting with talking about, how things are artificial. So I'm wondering if you could kind of tell the audience a little bit more about this perspective.
Well, the perspective is things that are important are hard and difficult, because if they weren't be difficult, the problem wouldn't still exist. And they take a long time. Yet, when we live our days, there's always an emergency happening of some sort. Minor emergencies, major emergencies, children crying, children doing this, some activity, something that you promised, and now, it's time, I have to do it. So, here's what I tell promising young academics, but the philosophy applies to everybody. Academics, they get promoted because they do good, solid research, which gets published in good, solid journals. Now, it's hard to do that. It can take years to finish a research project, and it can take many months to write it up well. So there's always something. There's always a committee meeting. There's always a class you have to get ready for. There's always students asking for help. There's always emergencies. Or you have to go to a conference. That takes time. If you do nothing but the most important thing for the day, you will never do the most important thing in your life. So what you have to do is because doing this very important research that you want to do in the writing up the papers or writing a book, well, it's going to take me several years, so okay, I'll put it off today. I'll do it tomorrow. Another day won't matter. Yeah, it does matter. So what I say is you have to put off a block of time every single day, and you sit down and you do the most important thing, like writing your book, writing your papers, thinking about your problems, where you're not distracted. You don't allow yourself to be distracted. If necessary, unplug the internet, unplug your email. And in writing, I say you must write every day. And I say spend 2 or 3 hours writing. Now, my experience is that when I do that, when I start, nothing happens. But I force myself to spend 2 or 3 hours in front of a blank screen, maybe typing a few things and throwing it away, and typing a few more and throwing it away. And it takes about 2 weeks before it finally starts to come. And my personal philosophy is, if some emergency comes and I say, oh, I can't spend that time today and nothing's happening anyway, I'm going to quit, I'll resume tomorrow, the 2 weeks starts over again. And so you have to spend those 2 weeks, and then it starts coming, and then actually you might be able to take a break once you're in the middle. Some people have different philosophies here, but almost every good writer does that. They block off uninterrupted time. And people ask me, when should we do it in the daytime? And I say, no, that's up to you. Some people, I do it by waking up early and working then. Some people do it by staying up late at night and working then. I've even heard of people who spend a busy morning and then spend the afternoon locked away writing. And it doesn't matter, as long as you whatever fits your personality and style. But that's what's necessary. And it's hard to do. You have to prioritize the most important thing over today's most important thing. And that's a problem with the kinds of, how do we attack the problems of the world? Well, climate change is invisible. And the ways that we pollute the world is invisible. And what do you mean we should stop coal-fired electricity? Because if you stop that today, what would I do for electricity? That's one of the problems, and that's a correct problem. But we have the other problem is that people's, especially the people in power, their income comes from generating electricity out of fossil fuels. And if we stop that, they will lose power and maybe money. And so they're fighting it. They don't want to stop. As opposed to saying, okay, maybe I don't call myself a power company or coal burning or whatever. Maybe I'm an electricity company or energy company, and therefore I will support any methods that gets it out, and I can support the good ones. Now, the good news is that lots of energy companies have started calling themselves energy companies and saying, we support electrification. But the bad news is that they just talk and they don't do. But talking about it is a major first step, because once they start talking about it, eventually they will have to do what they're talking about.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting perspective, because in a sense, what you're saying is that, this greenwashing that some companies do could be positive just in the fact that it's spreading awareness.
It's spreading awareness, and it's the first step towards success. It's like, the 10 steps of curing alcohol addiction. The first few steps are mainly recognizing it and stating it publicly, but you still often are drinking. It's hard to stop the drinking, the addiction. And so that's what this is. Yeah, I think it may not even be necessarily lying, as that is to say, they may sort of believe the statements they make, but they don't know how they can do it today, and they keep putting off because it will cost them money and we'll lose the money, and but it's absolutely essential. That's what I tell designers. If you think that your company is designing the wrong thing or doing it badly or destroying the world, don't go up and tell your executives that. They don't want to hear that. And it's not because they don't want to hear what they're doing wrong. A good executive always wants to know what's wrong. But what the executive really wants is the solution. So do your work. Go in and say, here's a better way of doing it. Now, you can't just say this is better for the world. You have to say, and here's what it will cost the company. And more importantly, and here's what we project in 4 or 5 years, it actually increases the sales and profits of the company. Because it has to be good for the company or the company goes out of business. And we don't want companies to go out of business. That isn't what we're aiming for.
How important do you think it is for designers to learn the language of business?
Essential. Designers complain to me that nobody listens to us. And I say, well, how do you talk to your bosses? Well, we show them the wonderful work we do. They're so proud of their craft. They show the work we do and the prizes we get. And I say, if I were the company executive, I would say, that's nice. Yes, very good. That's why we hired you. So thank you very much. And now let me get back to work. We teach designers that you have to learn the language of your customers, the people you're designing for, right? Well, one of the people you're designing for is upper management of the company. So speak their language, and their language is spreadsheets and profits and margins.
Yeah, I find this even applicable just for, I have a background as a growth designer, so there's a big orientation towards metrics. And I find this sort of correlation between what you're saying about getting really fixated on profit, for example, or whatever the metric is. Similarly, product managers or product designers can get really fixated on measuring just one metric.
Yeah, and they often pick some metric. We measure the productivity of a programmer by how many lines of code. That's a nonsensical measure. Every programmer knows that. You want to measure quality. You want to measure maybe how much time it took to reach the final product, even though some days they produce no code, or some days they produce 2,000 lines and a week later they threw them all away. But that's okay. That's the way coding or anything goes.
Yeah, that seems silly. I mean, also, wouldn't it be more efficient to have less code to achieve the same purpose?
That would be nice, but that often takes, first of all, better programmers and time to think it through. Because if you use less code, it's cleaner code. And it's actually going to be more efficient in running and easier to people later on. Almost all code has to be revised because the products change and what is required to do change, or new technologies come in, new requirements. So that small, compact code is usually the best code, easier to clean, to change, modify, copy.
And that advice that you're saying about designers already coming up with the possible solutions and presenting it to upper management or the leadership, I find that so applicable for literally every situation, because as you say, people don't want to have to think about, well, if it's not correct or if it's not optimal, what do we do now? It's more like, just provide me with the solution and make it easy so we can move forward with one of the options. Or maybe that causes a conversation even.
Yeah. And the solution, though, you have to really understand the whole company, because especially for products, the company, the designers are only a small part of the chain. Now, everybody doing their work thinks they're the most important part of a company. And I think that's a good thing, because you should think that your work is one of the most important things. But why else would you do it? Why else do you like it? But you have to realize that everybody thinks that way. And in the end, when you're doing a complex activity of any sort, there's no one part that's the most important. What's important is the way they collaborate and come together. And so you have to learn how to work with the financial people and the economics and the management people and the supply chain management and, yes, the engineers. But you also remember that designers come in many shapes and flavors and training. Engineers come in many shapes and flavors and training. So you can't say I work with engineers. You have to talk about specific role that each of them plays, and you have to be able to work with all of them, and manufacturing and delivery and sales and returns. And I recommend you should always go listen to the trouble lines when people call in and say, I can't do this, or I'm having trouble doing that. You learn a lot by listening to those people.
Yeah, certain companies, they actually require designers to spend like 10% of their time or something.
That's an advanced company. Most companies not only don't think of it, but if they do, they don't allow it. Well, why are you wasting your time doing that? Go back to design.
Yeah, there's so much to be learned from cross-collaboration between departments, and I find a lot of companies, they actually don't even talk to each other.
Well, there's some which worse. There are some companies that are competitive. In fact, Apple, its secretive ways, they don't allow the different parts to talk to each other. Somehow they feel that there may be leaks and public may learn what they're doing. Well, so what? But they lose a lot by not collaborating.
I bet. In the book, we talk about the focus on profit, but then you also talk about different measurements for growth. Can you tell us a bit about what other ways can we understand how we're doing and if we're successful?
What I really am trying to do is increase the quality of life. Yes, we can talk about sales, or we can talk about profits, a number of customers. Yeah, those are important, but they're not the most important thing. The most important thing, I feel, is how it is changing people's lives or assisting in people's lives. Because if you do that, people are apt to tell others about how they're using what you're doing. There's an example from IKEA, which makes relatively inexpensive furniture using a very minimalist, modern design, Scandinavian modernism. But they also, the first goal when they made them was shipping costs. And so they made them so it was easy to disassemble and put into flat shipping cartons with no waste. If you try to ship a fully assembled chair and you put it in a big box, most of the box is occupied by air. And you send something by ship, they charge you by the volume that you're taking up. So they saved a lot of money, but they also made it difficult to reassemble. So they worked hard to make it easier to reassemble. They also sell relatively cheap things that don't last long. And they tried to say at first, oh, that's a virtue, that you're tired, as you get tired of the lamp, it doesn't work. Good. Come back and get a different one, or a new table, or new this. And then also, they've been changing that. They've been making things that are easier to assemble and that last longer. Well, then there's a group of hackers, IKEA hackers, they called themselves, that said, hey, if I buy this table and this chair and this, bookcase, I don't have to build those things, but those are good parts, just like Legos. So those are the parts, and here's the sort of neat things you can build with this by combining these separate kits. And IKEA got very angry and said, stop it. And they tried to sue and said, you can't do that. But fortunately, the woman who was running the website managed to talk to some key people at IKEA and said, look, why are you angry at us? We're increasing your sales. More people buy your stuff because they realize the new modern things, new things they can put together. And so IKEA, to its credit, said, oh, they don't actually give it official support, but they give it semi-official support. And they're very supportive of that now. And I think they're starting even to point to the website where if you can learn other things you can do with our furniture. And so that's a company that really did care. And it modified its behavior and also makes it more sustainable. Now, in many ways, wood is a sustainable product too, because wood can be reused. And of course, the trees can regrow. And even if you throw used wood into the forest, that will decompose and become fertilizer. You don't want to overdo it, and you have to be careful what you've coated it with, whether it's poisonous substances and so on. But they're doing a good job, and there are other companies as well that can actually listen to the customers and do things that are of benefit to customers, that improve their life and do not harm the environment.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into maybe talking a little bit about circular design. So I don't think that a lot of product designers are familiar with the term.
Circular design has become very popular at this point, and it's hard to do. And so that's an issue. And designers, if a designer wants to advocate circular design, they have to understand the company a lot better. What alternative sources of materials do we have? How easy is it to take what we've been making and make it so it's reusable? And, what are the costs of doing this? And plastics are a particular problem because not only is it a myth that you can recycle them, you really can't. And not only is there some weird stuff going on, the magic triangle, which does not mean it's recyclable. It simply says the number tells you what it might be made out of, and whether it's recyclable or not depends upon what your local recycling company is capable of doing. And on and on. But they could do better. But plastics can be designed so they're reusable and recyclable. Or sometimes you don't have to use plastics. You might use something else that, believe it or not, you might invent something that saves the company money and is not doing harm. And I'm buying more and more products where they say, when you finish using it, send this back. I use Nestle coffee maker. The coffee comes in little pods in aluminum cans. But when I buy it, I can get a little bag that they'll give me. And after I've used the coffee, I put the pods into this bag. And when the bag is full, I can print out a mailing label. They pay the postage, and they say that every part gets reused. The plastic, the aluminum, that's easy. Aluminum is one of the easiest things to recycle. You just melt it and then reform it. But even the used coffee that's inside the pod, it becomes really good packing material or maybe building material or fertilizer. And so everything is reused, and they make it easy for the customer to do that. And they're not alone. Many companies are doing similar things.
I wonder if you've changed your lifestyle at all since researching and writing this book in particular.
Yes, we try hard to buy less things that are not going to be used permanently or that way will be bad when they're destroyed. We get upset when we have to buy things that are wrapped in plastic. We always carry our own cloth bags into stores and fill them up. Sometimes even with a bag is advertising the competitor of the store we're buying in. That's okay. And we also changed our habits. We stopped eating beef and pork because they're actually bad for the atmosphere. But, it's also good for us to have stopped because those are heavily saturated fats, which are not good for you. So basically, we're mostly vegetarian except eating fish, so it's called pescatarian. But more and more, we're going more towards vegan. The raising of poultry is bad for the environment. It turns out we're doing this a bit late in the cycle, which is good because now there are wonderful restaurants that make wonderful vegetarian food and wonderful even vegan food. And so we don't even feel we're suffering for doing this, but we made the changes in order to protect the environment because the more I learned about what is happening, the less I liked it. And the more I now learn about what happens in the fishing industry, the less I like it.
I can't remember what the documentary was on Netflix now, but I'm pescatarian, and it was a documentary on the fishing industry. And after that, I thought, oh God, what can I eat?
Well, there are farmed fish is better, and there are places that rank the farming because not all farming is equal, and some farming is harmful. But we use the Monterey Bay Aquarium's list of fish.
Interesting.
But
I also try to eat fish that are, let's say, smaller on the food chain, so more like sardines, for example, which are also really healthy for you.
Yeah, I can't eat sardines, though. It turns out I've been diagnosed with stage 3. It sounds horrible, but it's not. Stage 3 kidney disease. Stage 1 and 2 is almost never diagnosed because nobody ever notices. And there are no symptoms of stage 3 either. But it comes out in the blood tests when you have your annual physical or something. So at first I didn't know why it was on my diagnosis, and my physician never answered me. I switched physicians, and he said, well, let me show you. And then I started reading up about it. And the point is, stage 3 is fine. So he sent me to the dietitian who works at the hospital, who looked over it and then talked to me about what I normally am eating and how I eat. And she said, well, that's fine. You're doing well. And we had some recommendations, but don't have to do major changes in anything. Because the important thing about stage 3 is you don't want to go to stage 4.
Yeah.
So stage 3 is okay. You can stay in it for life. And so you reduce the amount of protein. Protein is important, but it's hard on the kidneys. So you have to eat enough. And that's the second is reduce how much salt you're eating. Well, turned out we didn't have to because we were already at the proper value. Reduce the amount of potassium and reduce the amount of phosphorus. Now, potassium, we were already okay. And phosphorus, that's a problem because it's really hard to know how much phosphorus is in food. That's not listed. The FDA has been asked to include it, but it hasn't yet. So you look at the ingredients carefully, and if it has the letters PHOS, then don't buy it because that means they've added phosphorus of various sorts. It may be it's unfortunate because they may have added just a tiny amount, but the major changes we made in our diet were for planetary reasons.
I'm definitely a bit similar. I also got long COVID really badly last year now and was just really ill for 8 months and had neurological issues. So I also changed my diet quite a bit.
Yeah, the problem with long COVID is that we still don't know what it is and how it impacts. But that's especially bad because if you have this horrible thing and nobody knows what to do about it, that's worse than, well, I have it, but at least they know how to treat it. My wife also has long COVID and has horrible coughing times in the middle of the night and so on.
Doctors are great in many cases when you have a very serious illness, but I did find them very unhelpful. So I did a lot of my own research and experimentation, actually. Kind of did like A/B testing on myself.
Yeah, well, one of the problems with the medical profession in the United States is the same problems that we've been talking about, that the medical profession has been taken over by the insurance companies and by the for-profit hospital systems. And there are very few independent physicians today. And some of that's good. they can learn from each other. They have these training sessions, etc. But it means that the hospital won't let you do things. You're allowed 15 minutes on the basic interview with a patient, and a lot of that is spent taking notes and writing it down. AI is helping with that. And the second thing is you can't get permission. I did a study for the National Academy of Sciences once, so we went around the whole United States looking at what we thought was the best medical systems. We were doing the study for electronic medical records, but we also, and most of the other people on the committee were physicians. I was one of the few that was not. And we discovered places where physicians deliberately misdiagnose the patient because they feel they're trying to understand what's going on with the patient, and there's a particular test they feel that will allow them to make the correct diagnosis, but they're not allowed to do the test. So they give you a diagnosis which they deliberately is fake, but it allows them, gives them permission to do the test they need. But the problem is that false diagnosis is now permanently in your record.
Yeah, sometimes I find that companies are, or let's say the medical industry, are so fixed into a way of doing something or a system that it's very hard to break out of.
Well, again, there are many, many people who are concerned about the quality of health and health care in the United States, trying to break out of it. But the problem is it's dominated by the profit-minded physicians, some of them, and also, but more importantly, by the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies. And we have to break out of that. If you want to look at some of the cores, that requires action by the U.S. Congress. And those are very difficult things, which is why I say, though, that if you want to make changes, in the end, you have to begin to understand the political process, whether you're a designer or a physician or just an ordinary citizen.
That touches on something that you say in the book, too, is that politicians actually don't have power. Can you expand on that? Did I phrase that correctly?
Well, was that first word politicians?
Yes.
Don't really have power. I don't know if I said it that way, but you can look at what dominates with politicians. I was actually, if you will, a lobbyist for a while, and not officially, but when I worked at Apple, I was vice president of advanced technology, which also meant that it was my job. I spent a lot of time in Washington trying to get the Wi-Fi bans approved, the very first ones. And so I walked, first of all, we had a lawyer there who told me what I needed to do. And I went to many, many of the Congress offices and talked sometimes with the congressperson, senator or representative, but more often with their staffs, because they are very busy. They have many, many, many different things on their plate. They do not have time to study the rules and the laws that are being passed. It's their staffs. And you soon learn to judge the really good politicians and the bad ones by the quality of their staffs. They didn't hire their relatives. They hired experts in these issues. And some of them had really good staffs. And I did the same thing later on for the high-definition television standards when there was a fight between the television industry and the computer industry upon what the standards should be. The television industry only wanted, with digital TV, we can put more channels in the same space and therefore sell more advertisement. And we said, well, it's better, higher quality picture and better quality sound. And they didn't care so much. And if you look at today's TV pictures and go back and look at what it was 20 years ago, it's hard to imagine people accepted the 20-year ago one. It's so bad compared to what we have today. But I came to find that there were really good politicians who were doing their very best. But again, they had very little time. And also the problem of being elected continually, and it costs money to do the advertisements, so that the people who give them money, even if the politician says, no, I'm not affected by who gave me the money, you are. It's hard not to be. And so, everybody has a boss, I always say. In any company, you go to the CEO is a boss. It's their board of directors or the shareholders and the shareholders' meetings. So everybody, there's some other outside force, like in the politician world, it's the people who are funding you to get you reelected. The world is complex, it's difficult, and you have to understand the complexity. That's the important thing, is that so many people take a very simple-minded view of the world. In fact, I think it's genetically the same, that as a result, that we think If I let go, it drops. And what caused it to drop? Well, I let go, and the force of gravity pulled it down. Yeah, that's simple causality. But complex things don't have simple causality. Yet we try to apply a single source that caused some result, and therefore we blame, when there's an accident, we blame the last person that was involved. Human error, we say, and we punish the person, even though the person could have been completely innocent. It was just everything was shaping up to do this accident, and the design was bad, and so the person gets blamed. No, it's not the person. It's a system. And it's very hard, though, to understand a system, and very hard to blame a system, because we want to blame. The whole legal system is really set up to blame individuals and not systems.
Do you have any advice on how we might get started impacting a system, let's say?
The first advice is simply more understanding of the complexity of the system. The other thing has to do with the way we design systems. We have to design it so the parts are more separable. They always interact. And any system is, you have the different parts for a reason. But if you make them, it's like when you write computer code. If you just write a million lines of code as one stream, it's really hard to go in and fix it. But modern computer writing isn't that way. That's how we started out. But we write small modules, and each of the modules is relatively independent. And in today's object-oriented programming, you don't even care about what's inside the module. What you care about is what kind of inputs does it take in and what does it put out. That way you can improve the module without changing anything else, as long as you have the same inputs and the same output. And by also having independent modules, you can often use them over again in other applications, or it's easier to change small segments of the program because there are sort of boundaries. But, if you're doing a complex design project or a programming project or any project, societal project, and it starts to involve hundreds of people, the hardest part of the project is managing those people. Because if you make one change, you have to make sure that everybody knows about the changes and how it might impact what they're doing. And some projects might have 1,000 people working on it. And so if you tell them about every little change, it stops all the work. And so it's really hard to make sure that the correct people always know about the change, but the ones who are not affected, they don't have to stop and think about it. So the management is the hardest part of these complex projects. But understanding the complexity is essential if you want to make changes.
What would you say to designers who are feeling in an IC position, who are feeling a bit powerless at the moment to make these changes?
The first step, some designers and some people in any discipline love their discipline and they don't want to change. They want to be experts in the detailed, specialized work they do. That's fine. We need those people. But every group also needs people, namely their managers, people who have been part of their specialty group, who move up to a management position and then up several steps. And each one requires a broader understanding of the way the company or the problem is actually being treated. So as you move up, in order to move up, it means you have to learn more about the other kinds of people that are working together, and you may have to learn more about the goals of the organization, and you'll have to learn eventually, depending upon if you're working in a country, you ought to learn the history of the country. Not the one that's necessarily in the textbooks, but the real history, which means read a couple of diverging textbooks. And as I say, you have to understand the political environment in which it works, because that may be important too, in which case you have to understand politicians and work with them. And you will find, I think, in almost every country, good people that you can work with, and that will help you. You don't have to do it by yourself. And not everybody has to become this generalist who knows everything and can work up at those levels, but you have to have a few who are there for helping make for better lives.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. As I got into this area, I of course was not a climate expert or a conscious design expert, let's say, but it was just something I knew I wanted to focus on. So I started doing a lot of research. I started reaching out to people. And in the beginning, I thought, oh, no one's working in this space and I don't see anything happening. But the more you actively reach out to people and do things and search, the more I discovered, oh, there's a bunch of people in this space doing really cool things. And I am just slowly uncovering it, just peeling back the cover, I guess. And now I know a bunch of, let's say, different people, resources, organizations, books, and it just keeps growing the more that I talk to people.
That's right. So this is where the United Nations SDG, Sustainable Development Goal number 17, becomes more important. As we learn about more and more of these other people, we need to group them together so they can work together where they'll have bigger impact. And, I point out that when someone has been looking at a problem for not very long and has this really wonderful idea, and they say, look, I say, why don't you do some searching? Because I bet you other people have had the same idea. And that not necessarily bad. That's actually a good way that says, hey, you're onto something. But then if you learn from them and maybe team up with them and read what they've written or seen what they've produced, maybe that will make you even better. So almost every idea, and if you would, in a case that you mentioned, if you think of problems, why aren't we approaching this problem? Well, actually, it turns out if you do the right search, there are lots of other people who have the same ideas and are trying to approach it. But by banding together, we might give more power to everybody.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. I'm definitely trying to build more in-person local community right now in Amsterdam. I was able to meet this guy. I think you were on his podcast, Thorsten, from Sustainable UX Network. Mm-hmm. We met in Copenhagen, and of course, we were very aligned on sustainability. So now we're planning an event together on April 22nd.
Amsterdam is one of the in the Netherlands is one of the centers of a lot of this good thinking. And I've been at a number of different universities in Amsterdam, which are really high quality. And my favorite one is Delft, still TU Delft. But there are good people there and working on just these problems. So you're in a good spot to find collaborators.
There's also Climate Week here. And somehow, I don't know if this perspective is accurate, but being an American and living in Europe, I find that Europe is more ahead when it comes to these things. There's a lot more. It seems that people are more bought in, that there's more support for it.
I think there are two things that help in Europe. It's Western Europe primarily. One of them is the EU is actually very responsive. Now, many of the countries in Europe don't like the EU because it imposes regulation upon regulation upon regulation. And it's really hard to work in a overly regulated society. And a lot of the countries are socialistic, which in America is considered a bad word. Somehow or other, the politicians have managed to let people believe that socialism is the same as communism and communism is bad. Well, first of all, if you read Karl Marx, it isn't bad. He was arguing against the evils of the basic capitalism, the capitalistic approach, which is money at all, no matter what cost to human life. And that's not what communism ended up being. And second, socialism is well within the democratic tradition. So the United States has the most expensive medical system in the world, but not the best. It's not even near the best. So there are problems, but it doesn't mean that everything is good in Europe either. And there are tensions now in the Netherlands as the immigration population comes in and people are really upset. And even people who aren't against immigration in general, but when you start getting the numbers in the hundreds of thousands or millions of people, it can be difficult for a country to figure out what to do. And this has been true in Scandinavia, and it's coming across all countries that we thought were doing wonderfully well are suffering right now, trying to know how to deal with these issues.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Trevor Noah was here and he won the Erasmus Prize. So he had a ceremony with the king, and I went to a talk that he gave, and he said something along the lines of, well, it's funny because if you're anti-immigrant, then you should be pro-climate change because climate change will cause so many climate refugees. And I thought that was such a funny point that he made because, they're anti-both.
Yeah, but they don't necessarily understand the real underlying issues. And it's weird for the United States to be against immigration. Because all the people who are against immigration are people who themselves or their parents or families were immigrants.
Everyone's an immigrant. Yeah.
No, not everyone. We do have an indigenous group that we've been we did our best to kill them off or isolate them, but we're finally accepting that that was wrong and we have to bring them back. But we don't want to bring them back into American society. I think some people want to do that. I feel we want to bring them back as human beings, but we have many, many different Indian cultures in the United States, and they should be able to live their own culture, but they should be full American citizens entitled to their own rights, but also entitled within their reservations. They were given treaties that said you are in control of your own land. So, but that's also true in many countries. It's not just the United States.
Yeah, true. I mean, I'm from Hawaii originally, and we also, of course, have Native Hawaiians, and Hawaii was annexed, so
Yep.
The 50th state. But I thought it was fascinating that you brought colonization into the book, and I was wondering if you could share maybe the significance of that.
I was part of a discussion group, which I mentioned. We called it the Beyond Computers and Cognition, because this main book, Understanding Computers and Cognition, was written by Terry Winograd, who's a well-known computer scientist at Stanford, and Fernando Flores, who used to be finance minister of Chile under Allende. Allende was a socialist, and the United States didn't like that, so the United States helped overthrow him and replace it with a nasty dictator. And Flores went to jail for a while, but then came back and moved to the San Francisco region and got a PhD in philosophy and met Winograd. Winograd had been one of the leaders in the language understanding movement in artificial intelligence. And his PhD thesis made him famous and done wonderful work. And after he met with Flores and spent a year or two with him, he decided everything he was doing was wrong. And he wrote this book, Understanding Computers and Cognition. A New Foundation for Design is a subtitle. And the book was published in 1986. And I read it when it first came out because I was a friend of Winograd. And I didn't fully get it. And as I was writing my book, this one, the latest one, I thought back and I said, well, I think some of the things I'm talking about are relevant to what Terry and Fernando were talking about. So I went back and I read the book and I wrote to Terry and I said, hey, that's an important book. And I think the problem was that you wrote it too soon. I think now people would understand it. And so he talked to Flores, and then Flores called me up to see what kind of a person I was. And we talked for a while. And for a while, I stopped and I said, there's a book you ought to read, because this is someone who speaks very much like you do. So Flores said, okay, what is it? He reads a lot. And I said, well, it was written by Arturo Escobar, who's been writing about the pluriverse. Flores laughed at me. Why are you laughing? He was my student. And so what we did is we formed a talking group with us, plus one of the other students of Flores, who is also a philosopher. And we met every week for several years, and we then terminated it for a while, but actually the next meeting is tomorrow again. And among things, Flores told me I ought to read the book called The Empire of Cotton. And I said, I'm not interested in cotton. But I came to respect him and his advice. And so after a while, and he kept reminding me of this, I finally said, okay, I'll go get it and read it. And I read it, and oh my goodness, it was all about colonialism, and about how Britain ruled the world, and it ruled the world and took over countries all around the world, and because it was the start of the Industrial Revolution, and one of the big things was textile mills, but they needed a better source of cotton, and so the cotton came from Indonesia and India, and so they took over, but eventually that was too far away, and they figured out that cotton was good for the climate of what is today the United States, the southwest to southern states. But nobody wanted to pick cotton. And so they figured out that they could get people from Africa. Because the African they were continually fighting. And when an African tribe defeated another tribe, they took the men and they sold them as slaves. So slavery was common in the world, actually. But so what the British did, and the English were powerful not for any other reason except that they had the most powerful navy. They could get away with all of this. So they would plant cotton, have cotton planted in southern United States. Then the cotton was picked, and I'll come back to that, and sent to northern England, where it was transformed into cloth, and the cloth was then manufactured into clothes. They could sell the cloth and the clothing to people in Africa, and they paid for it by giving them slaves, and they took the slaves to the United States, and now suddenly the slaves were of a different color, skin color, and so that's where the racism came in. There was no racism based on skin color before that time. And now it became because we could distinguish slaves from non-slaves simply by the color of their skin, which of course meant we often got it wrong, but nonetheless. But it was and that's where I discovered the power of colonialism, the negative power. And so then I started studying colonialism more and more and more, and realized that many of today's ailments can be traced back to the colonial times.
Yeah, that's fascinating. This is something that I think I've really grown up with, thinking about a lot, just because when you grow up in the Hawaii public school systems, you learn a lot about how Hawaii was taken, basically, and the queen was overthrown and held at gunpoint and had to sign the treaty. So this is,
Which is interesting, because if you read about that in the American textbooks, it was all a good thing, and that the kingdom in Hawaii was very open to the American way of life, and
Oh, yeah. I haven't encountered that view. That's funny. Yeah, growing up, it was very obvious that there was a lot of tension between Hawaii and the U.S. So you close off the book with the message that it's not too late. Can you tell us more about why you came to this conclusion?
I'm an optimist. I have to be. If I were not, I don't know how I'd live in today's world. But when it's not too late, it is too late to stop the rising temperature, but it's not too late to start doing things that will minimize the impact. First of all, I think we need to change our economic system. We have to change the ways we're living, et cetera, et cetera. But climate change is already happening. But I say to people, climate change, here's the good news about climate change. The good news is that it's here. It's causing fires and windstorms and floods and droughts and hunger, causing a lot of damage. That's the good news. Why is it the good news? Well, because for the first time, people are taking it seriously. And as we take it seriously, we will minimize the total impact that will occur. And that, in fact, the faster we start taking it seriously, the more the impact will be. Second, because there's going to be impact, we have to worry about what the impact will be, and we have to start looking how we are going to modify our lives and modify our homes and where we get our food and how we get our food to account for that, because it will change a lot of things. A lot of the island nations are going to suffer from rising water. The Netherlands are already starting to figure out how to adapt to the incoming, because the Netherlands, of course, have a long history of dealing with, well, they're below sea level already, and hence Netherlands. So it's not too late. There's a lot we can do. Don't give up and say, "Oh, it's too late. It's already happening, and what can I do but hide in a corner someplace?" No, we can really. First of all, we can minimize the total impact, and second of all, we can start the adaptation to the impact that we will be feeling. I have a lot of resources. I have a website in which I list a number of them, but I've been so busy I have not kept it up to date, but I'm in the process of trying to update it. So the name of my personal website is jnd.org, which I suspect you have found. And the website for the book is Designed for a Better World, DBW. So the specialized website is dbw.jnd.org, which I'm trying to keep up to date, but even not up to date, it has a lot of good references and resources. And I will try to add more. I'm trying to get people to help me do this. And finally, because I'm working hard on this design prize, its website also has, and we're starting to add, we just agreed that we're going to add a news section to it, which will add all sorts of references. So I went back and I listed the last 15 books I've read that are very important. And now what I want to do is state, I don't want to give a list of 15 books. Nobody will know what to do with it, but I can prioritize them and say what the focus of each book is so you can decide which one or two to look at. But also I'll probably post that information on all of my websites, all three. So you may have, I don't know, you've seen the prize website. It's DNDA, Don Norman Design Organization, Design Award, DNDA.design.
I will link everything in the show notes for the podcast, and I also have a newsletter where I send out the highlights and the actual recording, so I'll also send the links in there.
Wonderful. So thank you very much.
Perfect.
It's been an enjoyable conversation, and I'm pleased to hear the work that you are doing and also that way that you're learning and trying to approach these very same problems.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really fascinating and rewarding, and I'm also pairing it with investing in early stage climate tech startups, which has been a very interesting journey. It's been such a pleasure having you on. I'm sure you know, but I think so many designers look up to you, and you've really kind of paved the way for the UX industry. So it's really been a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.